Hello all, welcome back. I'm Avneet. I work with Informatica GCS, and in this we're going to go ahead and talk about JBoss cluster. This is part 2. In part 1 we had talked about all the configurations that are required to for a successful JBoss cluster. In this we're going to go ahead and talk about the steps that we can perform to successfully validate and troubleshoot a JBoss cluster, and also how to install Informatica MDM on a cluster. So I'm going to go ahead and move on to the next slide. In the previous section, as I said earlier, we had talked about all the configuration changes. In this section, we are talking about validation and troubleshooting of a cluster, and also about how to install MDM on a JBoss cluster. Saying that, I'm going to go ahead and move on to the next section. In here, I already have a JBoss cluster up and running. I'm gonna just go ahead and stop one of the nodes so that I can show you what all is required, how the logging happens during the startup and during the regular process of the cluster. So I'm gonna go ahead and shut down one of the nodes. So successfully issued a command. So while this is stopping up, I'm gonna go ahead and talk about the changes that we need to do to enable logging, which will help us in validation and troubleshooting of the cluster. And this logging is only required during the initial stage. Once you've stabilized your cluster, you don't necessarily need to have this clustering enabled, or you can limit down the level of logging to info or error. So I'm going to go ahead and navigate to one of the nodes that I just brought down. In the conf directory of that node, there is a file called JBoss log4j. You're going to go ahead and open this file, and in here I'm going to go ahead and search for a keyword called cluster, and this is the section that I'm interested in. By default, this section is commented out. Plus, in higher versions, for example 5.2 or 5.1 EAP, you will not have this section, but there's nothing to worry about. You can always create an appender in the log file and have similar configuration that will enable the logging. So to enable this, I'm going to go ahead and delete this commented out tag, place it out here, save the file. Also, so in this file I'm going to use JGroups as one of the categories and org JBoss HA as one of the categories, which are the two categories which help you analyze your cluster. For regular production use, you can either have this commented out, or you can set this to info. In your dev environment, you can set this to either trace or debug. In this case I'm using debug, but what I'm going to use is, for JGroups, I'm going to use the option trace. Alright, saying that, I've saved this file. The log files are going to get written on this directory. Okay. So I'm going to go ahead and bring up the server that we just shut down. So I'm going to go ahead and execute a script which I had talked about in part 1 on what scripts you need to, what parameters you need to pass within that script. Okay, so I've given the startup command. I'm going to go to the directory where we have configured the cluster logs. I'm inside the log directory. In there you see the cluster log file got created. I'm going to go ahead and do a tail on this file, and as soon as the server starts to join in existing cluster, you'll start seeing logging entries in here about trying to communicate, trying to find the members, and how the communication between the nodes happen. So if there's any issue or any error, like for example if you start your server and you see that it's not able to join a cluster, this file will tell you if there's an error between the communication of two nodes, You could either have socket closed exceptions, or this, or you could see that the connection is made but it's closing just after a few milliseconds. That means there's an error, there's a problem within the network. So this file is very useful. It gives you a lot of information about the cluster, on what all is happening within the cluster. So right in here you're looking at it's trying to ping the source, the other node members, trying to establish a communication with them by sending them the messages, acknowledging their messages so that a successful cluster is configured. So while this happens, I'm going to go ahead and close this file. I'm going to do a VI on this file. You're just going to go ahead and look at it, what all it prints. So in the very starting, you look at all these parameters that have been configured at the JGroups level cluster to successfully communicate. You're gonna find the version of the JGroups that you're using. You're gonna start seeing the initialization. Then you're gonna start seeing the server is listening on this particular socket. It's waiting for client connections. If you remember, in part 1 we had given a cluster name. It's here, right here, it's recognizing the available nodes. It's communicating with the gossip router, and so on. So you'll start seeing these messages coming in this file. If you analyze them, you'll be able to easily troubleshoot any cluster issue, like cluster failure, cluster communication failure. If your node is not able to join a cluster, it's going to clearly print out here why it's not able to do that. Alright, so this was about the troubleshooting and the validation part. So if you actually look at this file, in the end, once the server starts, it will print the information about what all members it has, so which have joined the cluster. Saying that, I'm going to go ahead and close this file, and we're going to go ahead and move to the next topic. That is, we're going to go ahead and talk about how to install Informatica MDM on a JBoss cluster. So going MDM 9.1 onwards, we support JBoss clusters, and by default Informatica uses the farm-based deployment. So what is farm-based deployment? So farm-based deployment is nothing but you configure your cluster and you place your deployment, your ER files and your data source and your messaging JMS files in the farm directory of the primary node in here. And once you do that, it will all the other nodes will automatically pull these files and deploy them as and when they start out. So you don't need to go ahead and install or place these ER files or data source files or messaging files on each node. But if you don't want to choose the farm deployment, you can alternatively deploy the files in the deploy directory, but you gotta make sure that you manually place the ER files in each and every node. So it's not a compulsion to use farm-based deployment. That was my point. So I'm going to go ahead and log into one of my other Linux sessions where I have an existing Informatica MDM deployed. In this, a few very important things to note down is, in a cluster you need to install MDM binaries on all the nodes, and their directory path should be exactly the same. So if you have, for example, if you have your deployment path like this, in each node your directory structure should be same. Alright, so once you've installed the Informatica binaries, you have the ER file on your local machine. Before you do anything, you go into the CMX server property file under resources. You make sure you set the cluster flag, you uncomment this property and you set it to true. This is required so that we can deploy the EJBs within our application in an HA mode. Without the HA mode, there is no use of a cluster, because if your beans aren't HA compatible, there is no point having a cluster because there is no failover. The second thing that you have to do is you have to uncomment this property out, and you have to list down either the host name or the IP address of all the node members. The other change you gotta do is edit this property and list down the RMI ports of each node. You can comma separate. Once you've done these changes, you can simply go on node 1. You can run the post install script. What it post simply do is it's going to go ahead and place your air files in the farm directory. Remember, as I said, by default we support farm based clustering, but it's not a necessity. You don't need to be on farm clustering if you don't want to be. So what you can do is, instead of running the post install, you could go under the bin directory after making the changes in the CMX server property file that we've talked about. Then run the cpan command and use repackage option to repackage the air file. I've just executed this command because I wanted to show you that JBoss cluster equal to true, what impact it has in the repackaging side. So when you set that variable equal to true, we are basically going to go ahead and ensure that all our EJBs are HA enabled. So as you see right here, we are preparing our air file for a cluster by ensuring that our EJBs are HA enabled. So once this repackaging happens, you got to go ahead and copy the air files from here to your deploy directory. Also, you got to go ahead and go under the conf directory. You have to copy the mrmds XML file to your deploy directory. You have to copy your JMSDS XML file to the messaging directory, your Siberian destination service file to your messaging directory. And once you've done, you just restart your nodes. You could start them in parallel, or you could start them in a synchronized fashion, one after the other, and your file Siberian MDM application will be ready on a JBoss cluster, ready for the use. Thank you all. I'm going to go ahead and end this presentation with that, and I would just again talk about this resource that you can refer to on the Red Hat side for any cluster related information that you want. If you want more knowledge about clusters, or what alternate options we have there to configure a cluster, you can always go to this link. It has a lot of useful information about JBoss cluster. And of course, we'll welcome your feedbacks on supportvideo@informatica.com, or if you want to go ahead and tweet about it, you can always go to Twitter info support. Thank you all.